Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to start. So, my name is Katja Pavlovic. I am from the International Council for Science. And on behalf of the organizers of this side event, which include ICSU, then the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, World Climate Research Program, and the Working Group 1 of the IPCC, I would like to welcome you to our side event on the urgencies in fundamental climate research following the Paris Agreement. As you all know, science played a key role in building understanding and raising awareness of the global change challenges that eventually led to the adoption of the agreement. And all organizers of this side event, as well as speakers, contributed to the generation and the assessment of climate science. ICSU, for instance, has been involved in climate research since 50s, and we promote an international research collaboration through International Geophysical Year and Polar Years. We also created with other partners major global research programs such as WCRP, SCAR, some of them are represented here on the panel, and also Global Climate Observance System and recently Future Earth. So now the Paris Agreement challenges the scientific community to look forward and to explore new horizons for climate research. And the goal of this side event is actually to outline key broad and urgent questions to focus on for scientific community. So we have the pleasure today to have with us Valérie Masson-Delmotte, who is the co-chair of Working Group 1 of the IPCC, and David Carlson, who is the director of WCRP, as moderator of this side event. And I would like to pass now the floor to them. David, please.
Thank you, Katja. Welcome. We hope you enjoy this. We hope you enjoy this little session. We want to bring you a view of science. I like the way Katja introduced these organizations. World Climate Research Program has the mission to analyze and predict present and future climate, but by partnering with ICSU, who has the mission to internationalize science, you see how we work together. And then the two co-agencies, Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, SCAR, and the Inter-Americas Institute, IAI, take this combination of excellence and collaboration to regional, and you're going to see a little bit of tropical and you'll see a little bit of Antarctica. So we like this overall composition of the panel. We are addressing urgencies in fundamental research. Despite whatever the news says, the climate system doesn't listen to agreements. And if you're watching to 2016, you know that the climate system has surged forward on many fronts. We also will need understanding and predictive skill to implement the Paris Agreement. And I think you'll hear from all of the speakers exactly how the climate community is responding to that. Definitely, this research that we're talking about informs the national, regional, and international assessments. And we have Valérie Masson-Delmotte as chair of Working Group 1, and she will chair the second half of this. And then there's a fundamental need to understand climate and the climate signals if we're going to build credible and effective adaptation and mitigation strategies. So I'm going to introduce then quickly the first four speakers. They'll each shift so they can run the controls from the central computer. We have Jochem Marotzke from Max Planck Institute. His interest and expertise is in oceans and ocean climate. We have Boram Lee from WCRP. She's going to talk about a WCR program on water availability for what we call the breadbasket regions. Irene represents the Antarctic research community, and she'll talk about marine plankton and ecosystem services in the Southern Ocean. And Arturo represents the land use, land change community, and he'll talk about biodiversity and habitat loss in the tropical region. So we've tried to give you a cross-cut of the kind of urgent science that's going on across the climate community. So with that, Jochem, please.
screen. Doesn't. Good afternoon. I'm speaking here on behalf of a small working group that was assembled by the World Climate Research Program and the International Council for Science Unions to think out of the box about the future of fundamental climate research. And the motto that we chose was climate research must sharpen its view. Sorry that... Our starting point was that the Paris Agreement has liberated climate research in the sense that we no longer need to discuss what we already know. The world is warming and humans are largely responsible. So now we must define the next research frontier for fundamental research, and we must probe deeper into the unknown. And we argue that the fundamental climate research can sharpen its view through three very simple yet very powerful guiding questions. And these guiding questions are: where does the carbon go? How does the weather change with climate? And how does climate influence the habitability of Earth and its regions? So why these questions, and what do they imply? When we say the carbon, it's the anthropogenic carbon. We must, of course, know where the anthropogenic carbon goes, because the pledges to reduce emissions need to be verified. We need to observe the fate of the anthropogenic carbon. I see this as an analogy to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty 20 years ago, which required verification observations through the seismological networks so that small earthquakes could be separated from nuclear explosions. And in principle, a similar strategy has to be pursued to follow the anthropogenic carbon. Why is this difficult? The input of anthropogenic carbon into the system occurs against the background of a highly variable natural carbon cycle. Two examples: when there is an ENSO, an El Nino event, land uptake on carbon changes from one year to the next. Or we know that the largest single carbon sink on Earth, the Southern Ocean, which takes up a lot of carbon, shows variability on the multi-year to decadal time scale. So if you want to analyze where the anthropogenic carbon goes, we need to factor in these elements of natural variability. The weather is what we experience day to day, month to month, year to year. The weather is difficult to predict in its statistics how it changes with climate change, because thermodynamics and circulation change hand in hand, circulation, atmosphere, and ocean. And we know that the circulation changes are particularly difficult to predict in a changing climate. They are particularly uncertain. And one of the challenges is that to understand and to predict the regional circulation, regional weather, we have to use models that are much more finely resolved than we currently can. So there's a very fundamental technological and scientific challenge for us. The third question, habitability. The basic question is what societies can adapt to or cannot adapt to. For example, temperatures might rise so much that we reach the human physiological limit to heat stress. Water availability may be threatened because the water cycle will change in a changing climate, and sea level may rise and inundate coastal regions. We are sure that some of these things will happen, but we are very, very unsure of where and when they will happen, and that's a particular challenge. So we believe that these guiding questions can help us shape the research agenda in fundamental research, but they are also at the heart of what society needs to know if they want to prepare for the climate change. But truth be told, society may not know always that they should ask these questions and should know it. But they do. And we do have to base the information that we give to society on a much more robust foundation than we currently can because of the scientific challenges inherent. But we also believe that we can provide this better foundation, that we can mobilize the human spirit. And the essential aspect is to bring new talent into climate research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Boram Lee from World Climate Research Program. Just following those three quick questions on carbon, weather, and toward habitability, I just wanted to introduce briefly as an example one of those collaborative research efforts from the climate research community to address those scientific questions to really step forward to improve the water availability for the food basket regions of the world. Just wanted to replace my introductory comment with this self-explanatory video showing introduced from our colleague in University of South Queensland. Can you please switch the sound to the computer? Okay, apologies. This doesn't work. I will find a way to make this media available for all of you. Just wanted to say that the productivity and well, toward the food security, especially the availability and stability, they are very much affected by climate, especially the water availability, impacted and changed by climate extremes and climate changes. So in there, what we try to address through this grand challenge from the scientific point of view is try to offer a solution on how to improve the water security especially for to secure food production. So we identified these key questions for the grand challenge. How will a warming world affect the available freshwater resources globally and regionally? And how does those translate specifically to the food basket regions of the world? So of course, within this context, we are focusing on geophysical process and the anthropogenic influence on the food production. So to do so, naturally, we need both regional approach and scientific approach. We are made aware recently of this new paradigm on with climate change, dry gets drier and wet gets wetter. Recent research showed that this paradigm is validated for those, especially the humid region in high altitude and some of those arid region in subtropics. But globally, we have so much of uncertainties, and this goes down to the need for we have to improve our understanding of what will happen regionally. And so this grand challenge, we focus on those major food producing regions of the world, starting from the Great Plain in North America and the Pannonian Basin in Eastern Europe, and also the South Asian food, the rice and wheat production region. And of course, we are hoping that these scientific findings can extend this benefit toward all the world food producing regions of the world. In the research topic, we identified the three main topics to start. First, how we integrate human dimension, the water management in a large-scale models. And secondly, how do we simulate and predict the precipitation close to the observation, close to the real patterns. And in that sense, it is very, very important we improve our modeling technology in the complex terrain, including the convection. And secondly, the land use effect and the interaction of land atmosphere toward climate and to simulate and understand better in a regional and global context. So in there, it is critical that these research efforts should build upon existing effort within and beyond the WCRP with all these research in water science, climate science, and also the agriculture and other related areas. And we continue our effort to work together with those identified international research program and the national experts. There is no need to explain that this research effort is touching on nearly everything, if not all, nearly many those sustainable development goals. And this I will leave from here for the further discussion with you. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Irene Schloss from the Instituto Antártico Argentino, but here I'm representing the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, and I will try to answer to the questions we've just heard about, but from an Antarctic perspective. On the question on how will the weather change, we have to think that Antarctica is already the coldest, the driest, the highest continent, and in this sense is a land of extremes. On the other hand, it's a continent that has not for a long time having data series, meteorological data series. We can have proxies, but large series are not available. So it is difficult to distinguish between anthropogenic change and natural variability. For instance, in the Western Antarctic Peninsula, that could be the case. So it is very important for us to see to understand how the new climate patterns will behave. Thank you. And have the new patterns arrive fast and understand the scales in which the weather will change. On the question on where will the carbon go, as my colleague here mentioned, the Southern Ocean is already an important sink of carbon, mainly via two different pumps, what we call the physical pump, which is the physical transportation of water via deep water formation and ventilation, the balance between these two processes, and biological carbon pump, which is explained by the biological activity of the organisms in the surface waters in the ocean. And recently we've seen that there has been a shift in the southern hemisphere and westerlies, a latitudinal shift and a shift in intensity, which is changing the balance between these two pumps. Usually the physical pump would be responsible for 1/3 of the carbon sink, while now with this shift, it could be competing with biology. And of course, biology is also affected by temperature, but surface seawater temperature, which is the part that's most affected. So this is also something we need to understand further. When we think about habitability, it's a special case because there is a treaty, there's an environmental protection treaty, what we call the Madrid Protocol, which protects Antarctica, which we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have a protocol like this for the rest of the planet. But yeah, it protects the environment, and it comes protecting the 8,000 marine species and 1,000 terrestrial species we have there, although there are many risks for these species. And it is more related to extreme events that could produce changes, important shifts in communities that we have to look at. And of course, the rates of change in the environmental conditions is something we really have to look at. I've been in all of my slides. I've been talking about scales, and this is something I really want to emphasize. The scales at which processes occur here in this figure you have in the x-axis, the time scale, and the space scale has no unit because it depends on the species we are considering or the group of organisms we are considering. But the stress can go from very short time scales, from seconds to minutes to many years, depending on the biological processes we are looking at. And it's not so much the variation in the mean conditions that will affect them, but thresholds and limit values that could push the communities toward limits where we could severely affect biodiversity. So well, I just said this. What are we doing in the frame of the Scientific Committee of Antarctic Research? We gathered 2 years ago for scanning the horizon to start to think about the questions that we would want to answer in 2020 and beyond. For the next 50 years. This was an international, interdisciplinary event where we thought about different groups. There are several papers that have been published about that. And we are really thinking interdisciplinary in the sense that we are trying to gather biologists and climatologists and glaciologists. Although I'm not speaking about glaciology, you'll have a talk in a few minutes. So this is the way we are doing, and this is a way we should continue to go. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Arturo Sanchez-Azofeifa. I'm a professor at the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Science at the University of Alberta, and I'm here representing the Inter-American Institute for Global Change research, specifically one of their projects called TropiDry, which is human and biophysical dimensions of tropical dry forests in the Americas. I would like to focus this presentation on one of the questions is where the carbon goes. And my argument is that we don't know that much about where it goes in Latin America. When we look at the current distributions of carbon flux systems in Latin America, compared with North America or even in Europe, of the 517 active worldwide FluxNet sites, only 25 are in Latin America. It's fundamentally clear that also that a lot of this information comes from tropical rainforests, and very little information comes from tropical dry forests, which we call probably one of the most forgotten tropical ecosystems. If I talk to you about the tropics, where your mind goes, it goes right away into the Amazon, and we forgot other key elements. Of course, this brings a lot of uncertainties, and also bring a significant amount of problems to global modeling in terms of how tropical ecosystems are responding to climate change. And I will also argue that this actually makes a very difficult task to actually validate current remote sensing missions, because we really don't have enough information from other sites besides the Amazon basin. On the other hand, we are constantly living with the issue, at least myself, with questions about things that happen rather than things that are happening. So it's not all the time that we have extreme droughts and we learn about the effects 6 months or a year after. So we really need to start thinking about that analytic approaches are necessary to satisfy some of these urgencies coming out of the fundamental climate research. So we move from this paradigm that we have, and it's called probably the fourth paradigm of science that is starting to emerge right now, in which we really need to have what is happening right now to make smart decisions in the long term. This is a clear example of some of these fundamental questions for Latin America. For example, how tropical ecosystems are responding in terms of carbon sequestration. Are they sequestering more? Are they releasing more carbon? Are we gaining more carbon? We really don't know. I mean, there is so much secondary growth happening, so much deforestation, that at the end of the day, we just come back with, in many cases, national estimates that are based on Excel forms to estimate those things. Let me give you an example. In the upper right, in this curve in the top, you have the phenological response of a tropical dry forest in Costa Rica. The first year of phenological response is the year of what we call a normal year. The second year is with one of the largest droughts in the last 50 years in Central American region is starting to occur. And the third year is the year of the full drought. So this is just the phenological response. So what is happening is, what we are observing is a decrease in the growing season of tropical dry forests. And in the bottom is the carbon response. So the one in red is the total primary productivity, gross primary productivity being observed in the dry forests of Costa Rica during a normal year. The one in blue is the one during the drought, and the one in green is the top of the ground. Fundamental question is how these changes affect carbon accounting, how these changes affect payments for environmental services. Those are fundamental questions that we cannot answer right now. We can answer for some sites, but we cannot answer for the whole tropics. And that has significant economic consequences in the long term. So I have a 5-point take-home message here. And I think that I was talking already before about the need for analytics and the necessity to have a paradigm shift in the way that we're starting to see things. I'm starting to think more about the Internet of Things when we talk about environmental monitoring. Also, it's fundamentally clear that we have great advances in carbon monitoring in North America with the Meriflux or the ICOS, but we don't have a Latin flux. It doesn't exist at this time. And I think that this falls right into the hands of and the lap of Latin American countries' governments that must embed in basic climate research associated to carbon sequestration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friends. It was great fun to show you these little bits of climate research that are going on. Next, I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Valérie, and ask her from her view of Working Group 1 to give us her sense of what the urgencies look like. Do you want to work from here, Val?
I'm going to move here because then I will chair the panel discussion, and we need to make room for all the panel participants. What I would like just to say on behalf of the IPCC Working Group 1 is that the IPCC is supposed to assess the state of scientific knowledge based on publications, and it's well known for the key points, the key conclusions from the summary for policymakers. But if you look at the last assessment report, for instance, in the technical summary, the last section is focused on where do we have low confidence, where are the key uncertainties, and there's a clear list of a few points that clearly echo to the presentations given today. Gaps in observations, for instance, with respect to dryness or ocean and atmospheric circulation or the deep ocean. Gaps for drivers of climate change, especially the role of aerosols and the interactions with clouds, the role of the carbon cycle feedbacks, and gaps in understanding with, again, the role of clouds, ability to relate, human influence, and many aspects of the water cycle. Many aspects of the Antarctic climate are still very poorly understood, and there are also gaps in projections. To give a few examples, ice sheet dynamics and sea level rise, what can be the change in variability from day to day for extremes and for year to year in a changing climate, or what would be the carbon release when permafrost is thawing. These are just a few examples that were stressed in the last IPCC report. And now we are at the onset of the 6th assessment cycle. We are having a number of scoping meetings, preparing 3 special reports done for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So now we have the first call for authors. Ongoing for a special report on the ocean and the cryosphere. Ongoing for a special report on issues related to desertification, land use, food security, and scheduled next May for the main assessment report. And when we do this scoping exercise, planning the structure of reports scheduled for 2018, 2019, and 2021, we need to be informed of what is emerging, especially at the state of fundamental research, that will be key for the new knowledge that we will have to convey through the IPCC reports very broadly and especially to policymakers. So this is what I wanted to mention in the way the IPCC is deeply concerned by this ability to stimulate new research in the context of the Paris Agreement. And for that, I suggest that we now have the panel discussions, and we have already our 4 speakers, and 3 persons will join us. Fatima Driouech from Morocco. So Fatima is the head of the National Climate Center in Morocco, and she's particularly interested by the relationship between climate change and extreme events, as well as forecasting extreme events. I would also like to invite Erika Kay, the executive director of the Belmont Forum Secretariat. That is a group of world's major and emerging funders of global environmental change research. So Erika, you are welcome in the panel. And finally, Wilfran Moufu-Maokia. So Wilfran is the head of science for the IPCC Working Group 1 Technical Support Unit. He's initially from the Republic of Congo, and he has a background in climate and weather modeling with a strong involvement in African climate. So with that, I would like to give the floor to those who have just joined the panel for a discussion on how do we go forward. And of course, how do we go forward means what are the needs for specific research related to the questions that have been raised, carbon, weather, habitability. What does the scientific community need to do? How to attract a new generation of scientists? And what is the perspective from the funding agencies? So maybe I would like to invite Fatima to start.
Thank you, Valérie. So I would like to talk starting from the aspect linked to extreme weather and climates. As we know, all weather and climate extremes are becoming more and more frequent and severe with climate change, and their impacts are generally bad and sometimes very, very bad, as we know all. I think there is still need for more developments and work in order to enhance the quality and the robustness of forecasts of extreme events and extreme events at different scales. I mean, weather and climate scales. And this is needed to help for a better risk management, for a reduction of negative impacts of such events. And to do so, I think there is room for better understanding of local processes and feedbacks. And also there is need for a denser and higher quality observation networks, especially in the regions with need, like, for example, Africa. Also, I think there is also room for more and better assessment and prediction of potential impacts of these events to allow efficient adaptation of communities and socio-economic sectors to climate change. So also enhancing literature production on impacts and vulnerabilities, especially in developing and least developed regions and countries, I think will have a real added value in this regard. Also, the integration of research institutions from developing countries into national and international programs should be very helpful for all, I think. And also there is need for efforts, for all the efforts, including young generation, and in my point of view, to attract young generations to participate to such research and works. There is need for more communication about its usefulness in saving people and property, and also communication about what we exactly know and what we still need to know and why. And I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Maybe Wilfran, you would like to echo to the presentation, the brief presentation of priorities from Fatima, still with the perspective of physical science?
Thank you very much, Fatima, Valérie, sorry. I think I would like first to start with a different stance, maybe a bit provocative here, and I will try to put my hat of a person who has been working with the developing country, particularly in Africa. Essentially, if you read carefully the question put upon us by the panel, my reading is that the key challenge here is, do we need to have a right balance between the climate science knowledge and the policy dialogue? In other words, do we want the climate research agenda to be driven by our government to serve the society, to put it simply, or do we want the climate research agenda to be led, driven by research in a kind of what I will call curiosity-driven research agenda? I think it's a bit of both, and Africa is an area where the two views need to be balanced. Now, to come back to the question put upon us here, my answer will be, if we want to stay in an African context, what is really needed in terms of research are what I will call more research on assessing the local to regional response of climate change, and as Jochem put previously, is how does the weather react under a changing climate? And associated with that is the issue of risk and impact, more specifically when we are thinking of moving toward more mitigation-driven scenario. Now, to clarify my view here, if you recall the outcome of the Paris Agreement, and essentially the Paris Agreement has put the climate research community in a very challenging place, because the Paris Agreement is looking for us to shift or to change the way we are thinking. And if you recall, generally the way traditionally climate scientists used to think about climate projection was to say, we think about a change by considering two specific time periods, one in the present, one in the future, under a certain emission scenario. Now, what the Paris Agreement is saying, you need to think about the mitigation adaptation problem through a process based on a global temperature target. And this is tricky because, as many of you recall, it's difficult for precipitation to be correlated with the temperature growth. So basically for different emission scenarios for a set of given temperature, you might have different behavior in terms of precipitation. But I will skip the technical detail. Now, if I want to lay down some, if you like, direction for the research, and it was mentioned by the previous speaker, will be the ability to provide spatially detailed, physically based model. So, which means a climate model with high resolution, more process, and so forth. And the second issue, which is not less important, is to try to be able to disentangle the contribution of model uncertainty versus natural viability. And I try to explain here, simply, if you recall the CIMIT 5 model, which are the bulk of the IPCC AR5 projection, what you realize, those projections are scenario or concentration-driven scenario, And what we realized, if you take the lowest end of the emission scenario, the RCP 2.6, there are a bulk of evidence indicating that those scenarios will stabilize around 2.3, 2.4 degree at the end of the century, right? Now, if we were to change the way we design scenario, we might also think about how we assess the uncertainty, the model uncertainty, because remember, in the case of semi-5 model, when we are targeting the end of the century, with all the evidence we have, there are indications that what is happening at those timescales, what is very important are the model uncertainty versus the internal variability. So if we have to change the timeline, so all the timescale will overlap. So we need to put on the table new science, new method to assess or if you like, to understand the noise, signal to noise ratio. That's one hand. Now, so how we can bring more young generation of scientists, and I think here where the African context can provide a good example, because if we admit that what is relevant is to put, as I heard in Africa, don't do the science for the sake of science, do the science which is useful. So if we keep that paradigm, what is important for us to bring more scientists is to show or to communicate about what we know in terms of science, what we don't know, and what the science can provide to the society. And I think that will help to bring more young scientists into the picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Villefranc. And the final word before giving the floor to the audience for questions will be to Erika Key to have the perspective of the funding agencies that is, of course, critical for development and progress in research.
Thank you. So I'm heartened by the discussion from my fellow panelists thus far, and I'm heartened because these priorities that have been shared are all areas that we are currently funding within the Belmont Forum. Now, the Forum is a partnership of funding agencies and ministries, and we collaborate together to advance interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science in global challenges. And this is important. They are global challenges. Any one agency or one country cannot accomplish the level of forward momentum that is needed to address some of these rapid and future changes. So the Forum definition of fundamental research includes the collaborative efforts of natural scientists, social scientists, and end users or stakeholders on every project that we fund. We achieve this through a virtual common pot. We don't pool monies together. Each interested agency or ministry comes with a budget to the table to support their eligible communities. And this allows us, through the collaboration, to reduce the stress of double jeopardy in competing processes. We, to date, have contributed over 100 million euros to areas relevant to many researchers here, such as coastal vulnerability, freshwater and food security, mountain ecotones, biodiversity and ecosystem services, Arctic resilience, and most recently, more than 20 million euros were awarded to multinational projects in climate predictability and interregional linkages. We have 2 calls coming out in December, focused on transformations to sustainability, which is led by ISSC, the International Social Science Council, in the scoping process, but again, requires the contribution of natural science, social science, and end users to develop or co-develop the approaches and co-implement the science so that it is more rapidly taken up through human action and adaptation to global change. So as we move forward with the Belmont Forum and growing each year, we just brought on board 5 more members. We have had more than 60 science agencies and organizations participate in our calls as supporters of science. And we continue to grow, but we recognize the need for training, capacity building to address the future calls that look at things like the common system of the Sustainable Development Goals, a very large task that is reflected in the world in 2050, which we're looking to partner into. We're conducting transdisciplinary training activities with ISSC to sort of reduce that fear factor of working with stakeholders and end users. We're also implementing an open data policy, and through the forum structure, introducing open data to a lot of countries and agencies that do not have open data policies. So I just wanted to offer this perspective that we hear you. We work with experts, with boundary organizations, and we look at the common priorities held by scientific funders worldwide to develop these thematic areas that hopefully will address not only the details of the Paris Agreement, but some of the potential impacts of climate variability and vulnerability in the globe. And we'll work continuously with partners to ensure that the 75% of countries that fall within the low and middle income category are represented in our process and are able to receive funding through our calls. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these three presentations. I think we can express this. And now I would like to open the floor to you in the audience for your questions. I think we will try to take questions first one by one, and if there are too many questions, then 3 by 3. So please raise your hands if you would like to start to launch this question game. Here. The microphone will come to you. If you can briefly introduce yourself and maybe precise to which person of the panel the question is designed to. Thank you.
My name is Jan Oliver Löfkamp. I'm a science editor from the German News Agency for Science and Technology. And I'm curious about your idea, Professor Marotzke, about the monitoring system similar to the seismological system for the nuclear test ban treaty. Could you give us a short view on your vision, how it should look like, what you will measure? And after the short description, it would be interesting what your colleagues are thinking about such a system.
Thank you.
Well, part of the effort exists already. What we try to do is from the measurements of the carbon concentrations, especially in the atmosphere, to infer the fluxes, the exchanges between the surface and the atmosphere. So the analogy with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is more on a philosophical and fundamental, not on a technical level. And so you have the satellite measurements of the carbon concentration, but you also have the local measurements, typically from flux towers, as they are called, that give us some estimate of the exchanges. And from that, you try to draw budgets on an ever finer scale. Currently, the scale of the estimate is limited to subcontinental, say elements of the United States. You can do that. But obviously, for some of the verification effort, we need to get to a much smaller scale on that, which requires both improved technology, but also improved measurements. And the other big unknown is there really the change in the ocean carbon sink. So all of this has to come together. So in brief, elements exist, but we need to refine this, and the challenges of that are huge.
Would other members of the panel like to comment on the question? Irene? Try to speak.
Hello? Oh yeah, it works. Yes. Well, I can only agree with what you say. Observing is key, like observing the ocean, observing the Earth, and in particular in the case of Antarctica, when we think of observing, it's mainly in the in the areas, in the coastal areas where most of the stations are located, or maybe in 1 or 2 stations which are in the continent, but it's a huge area that has no information. And so it would be essential to increase the amount of observing systems. The same could say for ocean observing systems, valid for Antarctica, subantarctica, but many other areas in the world. So I can't really say anything contrary. We need to increase observations.
Thank you. And Arturo, you also wanted to comment on the importance of the observing networks, I believe.
Yes, there are technologies evolving like wireless sensor networks that are starting to become extremely cheap for long-term monitoring. The fundamental problem that we have here is that, unfortunately, the science of monitoring lives in 5-year cycles, and that those cycles are associated with funding agencies. So the question is, how can we move away from those 5-year cycles into something that is more stable? And a lot of these projects are mostly for demonstration. So trying to move away from these long-term systems into this long-term system is probably one of the most critical elements when we talk about monitoring. I don't think that the science is an issue or the technology is an issue. I think that the funding for long-term is the most fundamental issue here.
Thank you very much. I would like to comment also that one issue related to climate change that will have a priority for the IPCC is the issue of cities, and it's the same problem. There have been tests to monitor greenhouse gas emissions from cities, but not sustained on the long term. That is the scale that is needed also to assess efficiency of policies at the scale of large cities, for instance. So raise your hands if you would like to ask questions. So I see here and then on the first line and then in the back.
Yeah, thanks for all your input. I am Johannes Kuhlmann. I work for the World Meteorological Organization for Climate and Water. And my question is, how do you want to design linkages between the funding for fundamental science and the funding for all the climate adaptation, mitigation, all the climate finances that's now ongoing? Because what we really need is we need to do something now. And those funds are starting now. And how can we make sure that what you guys are planning and doing really makes an effort in, really makes an impact in 1, 2, 3 years on all those, 100 billions that will float into all the countries that need to do something? So where's the link between what you need to do as a fundamental research into what really needs to be steered and guided and changed in all this climate financing and development world?
Thank you. Who would like to try to answer to this challenging question? Jochem? Yes.
This is, of course, the $64,000 question, and part of what we're doing is this very event. I alluded to that, so let me put it in more blunt terms, that if all the funding went into answering questions that we already know how to pose them today, that would be a complete disaster. We have, when we do fundamental research, we have to address questions that no one knows yet, or society doesn't know yet, that they should be asking. So that is part of what we are trying to draw up here, and also why we had this out-of-the-box workshop. It's exactly to get the dialogue going, to tell society, look, there are some questions you don't know that you have them. And I think that is absolutely crucial, in other words, that this is not business as usual, but we are defining new frontiers. And if you're in WMO, you know, of course, of the difficulty of linking weather to climate. There are new frontiers, but when it comes to climate change debate, the public discourse, the existence of these frontiers are not known to many people. So this is what we are trying to do, but absolutely no guarantees that this will succeed.
Who else would like to make a complementary answer? Erika?
So within the Belmont Forum, we work a lot with Future Earth as a boundary organization for us to be able to communicate between funding experts and stakeholders, which I'm using the term stakeholder in its broadest definition here. So we rely on those types of organizations to funnel from the grassroots up to funders and the priorities set by SDGs and other high-level organizations back down into the scientific community and find that nexus point where we can work together and leverage programs and funds. One of our mantras is be flexible. We just have to find the way to partners, so that we make the most of the money, the programs, the time, and using external partnership mechanisms, different phasing of funding, et cetera, so that we can achieve that most urgent need, and in a collaborative way and in a transparent way, so that the end results are immediately utilizable.
Thank you. Any other wish to answer? Yes? Boram? The other one.
Just wanted to elaborate from those two excellent opinions that associated with cost efficiency, linkage, and the effectiveness of funding to adaptation and mitigation. The role of this fundamental climate research is also to continuously provide feedback on how uncertain, what kind of uncertainty we are working on, and how that we can improve this efficiency and effectiveness from improved science and knowledge, and this is somewhere we can find the linkage on.
Thank you. So I suggest we move on to the next question.
Thank you very much. I'm Charlie Kennel from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I wonder if I might be indulged in first making a comment on the analogy with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and then ask the panel the question I hope to ask. On the CTBT, the issue had been, could you detect a clandestine underground nuclear explosion of low yield? And the question was not only it was a question of building confidence amongst the parties to the treaty. Could you detect one in an unknown area? Were they reporting directly? And so prior to the development of the treaty, some private sources got together and built the beginning of the International Global Seismological Network. And this then provided enough confidence to the decision makers that there could be independent verification of the statements made by the individual parties to the treaty. And so I think the analogy then is, in the area of climate, it's with space observations and projects like A-Gauge, where you make independent measurements of the greenhouse gas concentrations, and together with weather measurements, you can make some inferences about sources, and the existence of such a verification source that's independent and objective ought to build confidence amongst all the parties to the treaty. So I think that's my understanding of the importance of your remark. Now, my question is, I think to the whole panel, but I heard it said that we all understand that sea level rise will occur. And the real question is, when and where will it occur? And then, and this is, I think, places a strong requirement on climate modeling. But after that, there's a question, when and where will the decision makers presented with this knowledge, how quickly will they be able to act? Because we know that climate change, in the climate change era, delay itself is costly, and delay in decision making is costly. So isn't one more obligation of the science community to reach out to the decision makers and ask them, what will prompt you? What matters really to you? What impact of sea level rise is the one that will move you to make a timely decision to build resilience? And so I think the obligation to of the science community is to extend itself socially and also intellectually into the areas of impacts, economics, and social response. So I'd like a response from the panel.
So thank you for raising the issue of race against time between new knowledge and information relevant for decision makers. So I'm turning to the panel and would like to know who would like to
Let me take a shot at Charlie's
express
question.
views.
Absolutely sea level, but in fact, sea level is the easy example. We have coastal engineers, we have port managers, we have people who building runways on fill. Our ability to find stakeholders for the sea level problem is actually rather easy. I'm not saying we do it perfectly, but there are plenty of people who would listen. If we declared this as a sea level meeting, we would get a lot. I think the tricky bit is to take the questions that our science community correctly identifies as more hidden at the moment. Let's take permafrost carbon, for example, and say, while we're busy designing new ports and talking about coastal resources, etc., let's not forget about this other factor, and there could be several that will come to bite us. And I think it's science's mission not only to engage with the stakeholders on the obvious ones, but to also be scientifically rigorous on the less obvious ones.
I couldn't agree more. It's just that sea level rise is the most visualizable.
Would one of you like to express views on this question? Erika? Irene? Yeah?
So you hit at the very point of why we have the approach we do, why we require that triumvirate, and why we are now offering transdisciplinary training, because it is a new skill to learn, to bridge that divide and to work together, really, to frame the question together so that there is a decision-making tool or a policy prescription or some other result that spurs action in whatever way it can. And I welcome you because we'll be very close to you. At Fall AGU, we're actually having a special session on coastal vulnerability and freshwater security. And I forgot to mention our second call that's coming out in December is the food, water, energy nexus in urbanized areas. So you can imagine the absolute necessity working in an urbanized area on these critical human needs, having that interface within the project from the very beginning. So we do hear you, and that is why we operate the way we do.
Thank you. I think, Irene, you wanted to have a feedback?
Just a short comment. Glacier melting and sea level increase that's published, it's a publication, an important publication coming every once in a while. I couldn't tell exactly the frequency, but it's something that's known. I know you mean, and it's not only because of atmosphere heating, but also because of the water, the ocean heating. So it's something that governments could already take care of because that's known. It's gonna happen. It's happening.
I think Jochem or Villefranche? Jochem and Villefranche.
Sorry, won't be long here. Just trying to follow up on what was said by Mr. here. Probably the question beyond the sea level example is applicable to everything. And just to pick up on this, what I was thinking is probably, and that's an idea I forgot to put on the table, is thinking on the way forward, what I would like to suggest, or probably would be for the climate or the impact assessment modeling community to work more with the impact community. Because if you remember, I don't know, I don't want to put people in a bad mood here, but quite often our colleagues for the climate impact community have been using climate models which are not designed or fit for purpose. They were built and then they follow up. Maybe we need to revert the paradigm, try to work together and come up with the key questions, the key tools. That was my view, if I may. Thank you.
I think we take just the last answer so that we have time for further questions.
I am not afraid of putting people in a bad mood, so we'll do that here. Actually, to address your question, I think we have to reach much more broadly into the interdisciplinary research and discourse than indicated. very often inaction on climate mitigation does not occur because of lack of knowledge. Take the German government. They know perfectly well that climate is changing. The IPCC reports are the official fundamental basis. And yet the German public is still waiting whether our environmental minister will come up with a climate mitigation, climate protection plan for this very COP22. Currently, there is none. This is not because of lack of knowledge, it's because the economic and agricultural and transportation ministries have shot down the plan that the environmental minister has put up. So it's not a question of lack of knowledge, it's a question of sort of political realizability. And this issue of what is realizable and why is a very, very deep political and social science question that has to be more in the mainstream of climate research.
Thank you. So the lady here has been waiting for a long time for the next question.
Hi, my name is Kayla Hardy. I'm a physics and computer science undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo. And today it was mentioned in the panel that we need to encourage youth to join climate research. And I'm wondering if the panel has any suggestions, because personally I've been to many physics conferences and I've wanted to present some research on climate change, but normally they have categories and climate change is never one of them. There's astrophysics, there's quantum mechanics, and even computer science does amazing climate change research. And I'm just wondering, I'm here representing the students and I want to be able to come back and be like, hey, all science people, like look at what all the cool things we can do in climate research. But I don't know what the best approach is, and I want to help kind of close the gap here because there seems to be a bit of a gap. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think Arturo would like to start.
Let's see.
The
I think that you make a very good point, especially coming from computer sciences. When I deal with my colleagues in computer sciences, they always tell me, just give me the data and I will find the pattern. And that's the end of it. And they don't look at processes, they don't look at what the data is going to be used for. And that has been very typical so I think that we need to start first by talking to your professors and make them to change the paradigm, the way that they're teaching you. So when they go and organize their meetings, they can actually put this context in the different meetings that you guys are attending. But also, just to remind you that there is the American Geophysical Union meeting that every year has 25,000 people and hundreds of sessions that are open to everybody where you can submit papers there. So there is venues where you can actually go. What you need to do is basically to find where those menus are. And we are always love to have computer scientists because you have tremendous skills that sometimes we don't have, but we need them, so we need you. So, but if you don't talk, we never know that you exist. So I encourage you to go to the AGU, especially to present your science. That would be really interesting.
So who else would like to? Okay, so Irene and then Boram.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think you addressed several different questions. One is the participation here in fora like this to give you a place, but there are many meetings in which youth or early career scientists are really welcome on their special, like for polar sciences, there's the APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, and there's always room for young scientists that are starting or students that want to present to do something. And this is very encouraging. Maybe in your field there is no such an association, but I would encourage you to form one, because this really helps a lot. But then the other problem we get, or actually it's hard to interest young students in following a scientific career, period. That's it. And this is mainly because there's no job afterwards. You may have a wonderful PhD. If you're lucky, you get 2 or 3 postdocs, and then there's a gap. So financing, it's another issue. Financing the continuity or allowing these people to have a long-term perspective and plan their research already at a postdoc with a longer-term perspective, that would be what the governments would need to finance.
I think Boram, you are next.
Yes, just briefly. I was keep looking at Dave while you're
expressing your opinion, and which we really appreciate. In fact, I think it's two-way interaction. It's while early career scientists, the youth, young generation are looking to ways to really express themselves and make their ways and make future careers. At the same time, the research community is looking to the younger generation to break the boundaries and our sort of conventional thought. And in fact, for example, in the WCRP, we always have been talking about the climate science. We have to, break the boundary between weather and climate, between hydrology, between social science and natural science. But actually, what it has been happening actively was from the younger generation, early career scientists. There is one, network of early career scientists that working closely with WCRP, and in there, taking an example, we have a very active architect working with climate scientists and reflecting this future climate change into her design of buildings. And this is something we always have been thinking about, but somebody who put it into action is younger generation. And in fact, the WCRP and actually Irene made an example of this Apex for the polar scientists. And we have those networks of early career scientists that the research programs are actively supporting. And we will be very glad to anybody who are interested working with us.
Jochem, you also wanted to comment?
Very briefly, just keep going. There will be graduate school and then everything will change. The physics community is quite narrow-minded when it comes to that. I know that I once was a physicist. And so, but in our graduate school, we love getting the applications from the, if you wish, the basic, the foundational sciences. So just keep going.
I would like to come back also to this point. I work in a center doing basic physics research. And it goes from the scale of atoms to the scale of the universe. And, planet Earth is just in between as a complex system with exciting scientific challenges that are well understood by those doing astrophysics or atom physics as a complex system with, imperfect data, imperfect models, and the need for new concepts. And I also wanted to mention that for the IPCC, including early career scientists is a challenge because you need to prove you're an expert of the field through publications to be selected as an author. But we really would like to follow what was done by Working Group 2 and 3 in the past, that they were inviting early career scientists on a volunteer basis to be what was called chapter scientists. So providing volunteer support for authors, for managing references, for helping for figures. And that's also a nice way of engaging volunteer early career scientists in the work of the IPCC. Any other question from another person? And then we will come back to you if there is time. Yes.
Hi, Pedro Faria from CDP, the former Carbon Disclosure Project. We are an NGO working with investors and business and working to get transparency on climate challenges. We use data to put that data at the heart of decision making by investors, policymakers, and companies. And we think that climate science should definitely inform all that decision making. And I go back to this challenge, which is, let's say, the application of the fundamental knowledge that you are creating. We recently, back in 2014, we used the work on climate modeling and basic science on carbon budgets, for example, to develop tools that allow companies to understand, based on scenarios that are compatible with the RCP 2.6, where they should be heading in terms of emissions reductions. We have used that as a basis of a campaign that is promoting action by many of the world's largest companies. And I think it's a bit of this that we need more. We need to think of climate science and then, you know, as fundamental research, but think of a pipeline of applied research. How can we apply it to products that really influence not only, you know, policymakers, but companies, investors, consumers, the general audience. And I was very happy to hear about the change in philosophy in terms of the funders' approach. But I would like to hear from you your challenges in terms of, you know, getting these to the point of application. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm turning to the panel to see who would like to react first on this issue of translating both the outcomes and the needs of fundamental research for other audiences, including the business sector. Fatima first, and then Villefranc.
Yeah. Just quickly, I agree that scientific community has developed a lot of tools, lot of useful tools, and has reached a lot of knowledge. Sure, there is need for more knowledge, but there is also need for more application, for more help to the partners, to the final users, on how they can integrate these outputs, this information, this data, and how to take benefits from the tools developed by the climate community. So I agree that there is an added value if we work on how to deal with this aspect and to bring together climate scientists and final users to reach the final link of the chain, and then to reach our goal, I think, which is dealing with the climate change challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. I think Villefranc, you are next, and then I have seen also Irene and Arturo willing to provide their answers.
Thank you very much for your very insightful question. Just a bracket. Before moving to the IPCC, I used to work for the United Nations Economic Commission, where actually the question you raised was the main question. Now, the trick, or if you like, the trouble is, from that angle, what people want is for climate science to serve services. That's one of them. But what people tend to forget before you turn your knowledge or your climate science knowledge into a usable product, to put it bluntly, there is a long series of fundamental research we need to be backing your stuff. Now, the stand Africa is taking, and that's probably something we need to revisit at some point, is that quite often the demand for the policymaker is to put product on the table. So they will finance, and you see, and that's probably unfortunate, different stakeholder development agencies, Sweden, France, putting money on the table for usable climate science product, but forgetting about the science which is needed behind. So we need to strike a balance, or we are not able to communicate to the donor what is really needed before we turn into product. But again, that's a debate. And just next door, there is the GFCS, the Global Framework for Climate Services, which also thinking about this. But again, from the GFCS point of view, what is really interesting, they are backing their product by the science. Thank you.
Thank you. Irene?
Yes, I just wanted to comment. More and more, the funding agencies are asking us to provide projects that are from natural sciences, social sciences, and that includes stakeholders. As Erika just mentioned, it's a new trend. It's new, relatively new. I happen to work for some time in Quebec, and in Quebec, it's like obligation. You have to do it like this, otherwise you won't get funded. But then you have a problem. We have a problem, and this is a mea culpa I'm doing. It is not easy for us to work with social scientists and to work with stakeholders. It's really, we have to learn a new language, we have to share, we have to understand each other. That's not an easy task. It's a new vocabulary that we have to develop. And if you then combine it with the private or with someone working in the industry or the common person in the street, then you have an additional challenge because you have to modify your language again. But this is something we are facing more and more because otherwise, and I agree, some fundings require it and you won't get funded unless you put it. So I think we are moving in that direction and the funding agencies are moving in that direction as well.
Thank you. And Arturo, you will have the final word on this question.
Yes, you mentioned something that attracts my attention right away, which is transparency. And I think that this is fundamental in business world, and even as a small business owner, I think that you make a very important point. But I think that, let me put it that way very bluntly, I think that we as a scientist, sometimes we fail, and we fail a lot communicating this to the communities. I bet you if we get out here right now, this compound, and we're asking people, what do you think about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees? Half of these people say, what are you talking about? So I think that we fail in communicating this basic science. In the Inter-American Institute, we have been trying to communicate this science in Latin America. And for example, today we launched an online massive course in Spanish with 22 of our researchers in 8 countries and 22 institutions to actually trying to bring that knowledge into the community, into the guy in the bus that has internet and he can learn a little bit more about what is sea level rising, what it means that the glaciers are melting. I mean, what that means to everybody. So I think that this element of transparency has to go across all the way into the civil society. And the education component of climate change is something that we are failing. I don't want to sound like Donald Trump because it's really bad. But I think that we really need to pay attention to that. And I think that with the IAI, we tried to put a little bit of grain on that direction, communicating these kind of elements to the Latin American community. But we are far away to achieve full transparency. I totally agree with you.
Thank you very much. So now we are arriving to the last 5 minutes of this session of questions and answers. So I suggest we take the final question, and just in the back of the room here. Thank you.
My name is Natalia, and I'm a master's student from the Netherlands studying renewable energy. And my question is, what is your opinion on such controversial research as geoengineering, for instance, and solar radiation management? And do you think we need more research in this area?
So the question is about geoengineering and solar radiation management. And what is your position about the need for more research in that direction? Who would like to start? Jochem. It was addressed in the chapter on clouds and aerosols in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC after intensive discussions amongst the authors of the report, I have to say. So Jochem, what is your
Well, 10 years ago,
position?
there was a bit of a discussion whether one should do research or whether the research wouldn't, in a way, make the thinking about geoengineering acceptable. But I think essentially with Paul Krutzen's paper from 10 years ago, the cat was out of the bag. And I don't think we have any option except to do the research to try to understand what might happen. The problem is that especially solar radiation management lends itself to unilateral application. And I think if we do not understand what the consequences are, we are in a bad position possibly to counter unilateral decisions. So I believe the research is essential so that we have good arguments for not doing it. That is, I am absolutely convinced that will be the outcome. The more we know, the more arguments we will have for not doing it, especially solar radiation management. The more robust our knowledge is, the better arguments we will have.
Thank you for this clear statement. Irene, you wanted to comment? Any other willing to comment on this question? No? Okay, so now I'm turning to our person from early career scientists, and you wanted to come back to the panel, so you will have the final word.
Okay, lucky me. The panelists touched on how I could further my early scientific career, but I'm also very interested in helping my colleagues not I'm not pressuring them to pursue a degree in climate science, but just so that they're aware of it. I mean, I have people in physics come up to me like, oh, I might go into climate science because I hear there's jobs there. And that's an afterthought. It's not like, oh, climate science is really cool or it exists really. It's like, oh, okay, if thermal doesn't work out, I'll go to climate science. So.
Yes, who? Erica?
I think as we've shown here as a panel and from the questions you've heard, climate science can really encompass a lot more than just physics. And so it would be interesting to understand what their backgrounds are, or what their interests would be. You know, climate adaptation, climate communications. We have a lot of need as we move forward here. So I think the breakthroughs, this was mentioned before, by early career, that's an area that has strong support financially. Typically, you'll see support for students to go to meetings. There are a lot of mid-career scientists that would like that support, I think, in this day and time. So I think climate science, it's almost like saying science. It's got that level of grayness to it, and so I would just encourage them to find the motivation that most speaks to them. And certainly within our context, there is that breadth of interest, whether you're looking at climate from an oceans perspective, from an economic perspective, from translating decisions to indigenous peoples, working with stakeholder communities, working with industry. There's certainly a lot of potential.
Thank you very much. David, would you like to have a final word?
I'm going to address this question. You'll need an observational record, and you'll find out that it has a 10-year gap right in the middle where you can't do anything about it. You're going to build a climate model that's so elaborate that you can't get time from your climate center to actually run it. And once you have a publishable piece, you're going to find that no journal will take it, okay? So other than that, we think that this is exactly the right science, exactly the right topics, and exactly the right contribution to society. But that's the message that we're wrestling with. I mean, it's a difficult challenge. I only want to say congratulations to you. You've heard 7 of the best climate scientists from around the world and got a little an enjoyable piece from each of them. Valérie, it's been my pleasure to work with you. Katya and Iksu, thank you very much for getting this organized for all of us. And I think most of us are around for a couple of days. Please come and pick our brains. It's really been our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's worse if you are like Belgium working with France because then
Being a reviewer of that's because otherwise you know what's there. Yes.